Chapter 19 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 19. My Turn. I had known for some time that Sir Gilbert Carstairs had a small yacht lying at one of the boat houses on the riverside. Indeed, I had seen her before ever I saw him. She was a trim, graceful thing, with all the appearance of an excellent sea boat, and though she looked like a craft that could stand a lot of heavy weather, she had the advantage of being so light in draught, something under 3 feet, that it was possible for her to enter the shallowest harbour. I had heard that Sir Gilbert was constantly sailing her up and down the coast, and sometimes going well out to sea in her. On these occasions he was usually accompanied by a fisher lad whom he had picked up somehow or other. This lad, Watty Mason, was down by the yacht when I reached her, and he gave me a glowering look when he found that I was to put his nose out for this time at any rate. He hung around us until we got off, as a hungry dog hangs around a table on the chance of a bone being thrown to him, but he got no recognition from Sir Gilbert, who, though the lad had been useful enough to him before, took no notice of him that day than of one of the pebbles on the beach. And if I had been more of a student of human nature, I should have gained some idea of my future employer's character from that small circumstance, and have seen that he had no feeling or consideration for anybody unless it happened to be serving and suiting his purpose. But at that moment I was thinking of nothing but the pleasure of taking a cruise in the yacht in the company of a man in whom I was naturally interested. I was passionately fond of the sea, and had already learned from the Berwick sea-going folk how to handle small craft, and the management of a 3-oar vessel like this was an easy matter to me, as I soon let Sir Gilbert know. Once outside the river mouth, with a nice light breeze blowing off the land, we set square sail, mainsail, and foresail, and stood directly out to sea on as grand a day and under as fair conditions as a yachtsman could desire. And when we were gaily bowling along, Sir Gilbert bade me unpack the basket which had been put aboard from the hotel. It was a long time, he said, since his breakfast, and we would eat and drink at the outset of things. If I had not been hungry myself, the sight of the provisions in that basket would have made me so. There was everything in there that a man could desire, from cold salmon and cold chicken to solid roast beef, and there was plenty of claret and whisky to wash it down with. And considering how readily and healthily Sir Gilbert Carstairs ate and drank, and how he talked and laughed while we lunched side by side under that glorious sky, gliding along over a smooth, innocent-looking sea, I have often wondered since if what was to come before nightfall came of deliberate intention on his part, or from a sudden yielding to temptation when the chance of it arose. And for the life of me I cannot decide. But if the man had murder in his heart while he sat there at my side, eating his good food and drinking his fine liquor, and sharing both with me, and pressing me to help myself to his generous provision, if it was so, I say, then he was of an indescribable cruelty, which it makes me cringe to think of, and I would prefer to believe that the impulse to bring about my death came from a sudden temptation springing from a sudden chance, and yet, God knows, it is a difficult problem to settle. For this was what it came to, and before sunset was reddening the western skies behind the Cheviots. We went a long, long way out, far beyond the 30-fathom line, which is, as all sailors acquainted with those waters know, a good 7 miles from shore. Indeed, as I afterwards reckoned, we were more than twice that distance from Berwick pier end when the affair happened, perhaps still further. We had been tacking about all afternoon, first south, then north, not with any particular purpose, but aimlessly. We scarcely set eyes on another sail, and at a little after 7 o'clock in the evening, when there was some talk of going about and catching the wind, which had changed a good deal since noon, and was now coming more from the southeast, we were in the midst of a great waste of sea, in which I could not make out a sign of any craft but ours, not even a trail of smoke on the horizon. The flat of the land had long since disappeared. The upper slopes of the Cheviots on the one side of Tweed, and of the Lammermoor Hills on the other, only just showed above the line of the sea. There was, I say, nothing visible on all that level of scarcely stirred water but our own sails, set to catch whatever breeze there was, when that happened which not only brought me to the very gates of death, but, in the mere doing of it, gave me the greatest horror of any that I have ever known. I was standing up at the moment, one foot on the gunwale, the other on the planking behind me, carelessly balancing myself while I stared across the sea in search of some object which he, this man that I trusted so thoroughly and whose company I had spent so many pleasant hours that afternoon, and who was standing behind me at the moment, professed to see in the distance, when he suddenly lurched against me, as if he had slipped and lost his footing. That was what I believed in that startling moment, but as I went head first overboard I was aware that his fall was confined to a sprawl into the scuppers. Overboard I went, but he remained where he was. And my weight, I was weighing a good 13 stone at that time, being a big and hefty youngster, carried me down and down into the green water, for I had been shot over the side with considerable impetus. And when I came up a couple of boat lengths from the yacht, expecting to find that he was bringing her up so that I could scramble aboard, I saw with amazed and incredulous affright that he was doing nothing of the sort. Instead, working at it as hard as he could, he was letting out a couple of reefs which he had taken up in the mainsail an hour before. In another minute they were out, the yacht moved more swiftly, and springing to the tiller, he deliberately steered her clear away from me. I suppose I saw his purpose all at once. Perhaps it drove me wild, mad, frenzied. The yacht was going away from me fast, faster. Good swimmer though I was, it was impossible for me to catch up to her. She was making her own length to every stroke I took, and as she drew away he stood there, one hand on the tiller, the other in his pocket. I have often wondered if it was fingering a revolver in there, his eyes turned steadily on me. And I began first to beg and entreat him to save me, and then to shout out and curse him, and at that, seeing that we were becoming further and further separated, he deliberately put the yacht still more before the freshening wind, and went swiftly away, and looked at me no more. So he left me to drown. We had been talking a lot about swimming during the afternoon, and I had told him that though I had been a swimmer ever since my boyhood, I had never done more than a mile at a stretch, and then only in the river. He knew, therefore, that he was leaving me a good 14 miles from land with not a sail in sight, not a chance of being picked up. Was it likely that I could make land? Was there ever a probability of anything coming along that would sight me? There was small likelihood, anyway. The likelihood was that long before the darkness had come on I should be exhausted, give up, and go down. You may conceive with what anger and with what fierce resentment I watched this man and his yacht going fast away from me, and with what despair, too. But even in that moment I was conscious of two facts. I now knew that yonder was the probable murderer of both Phillips and Crone, and that he was leaving me to die because I was the one person living who could throw some light on those matters. And though I had kept silence up to then, might be tempted or induced or obliged to do so, he would silence me when he had so good a chance. And the other was, that although there seemed about as much likelihood of my ever seeing Berwick again as of being made King of England, I must do my utmost to save my strength and my life. I had a wealth of incentives: Maisie, my mother, Mr. Lindsey, youth, the desire to live, and now there was another added to them, the desire to circumvent that cold-hearted, cruel devil who, I was now sure, had all along been up to some desperate game, and to have my revenge and see justice done on him. I was not going to give in without making a fight for it. But it was a poor chance that I had, and I was well aware of it. There was small prospect of fishing boats or the like coming out that evening, small likelihood of any coasting steamer sighting a bit of a speck like me. All the same, I was going to keep my chin up as long as possible, and the first thing to do was to take care of my strength. I made shift to divest myself of a heavy pea-jacket that I was wearing, and of the unnecessary clothing beneath it. I got rid, too, of my boots, and after resting a bit on my back and considering matters, I decided to make a try for land. I might perhaps meet some boat coming out. I lifted my head well up and took a glance at what I could see, and my heart sank at what I did see. The yacht was a speck in the distance by that time, and far beyond it the Cheviots and the Lammermoors were mere bits of grey outline against the gold and crimson of the sky. One thought instantly filled and depressed me. I was further from land than I had believed. At this distance from it I have but confused and vague recollections of that night. Sometimes I dream of it, even now, and wake sweating with fear. In those dreams I am toiling and toiling through a smooth sea. It is always a smooth, oily, slippery sea, toward something to which I make no great headway. Sometimes I give up toiling through sheer and desperate aching of body and limbs, and let myself lie drifting into helplessness and a growing sleep. And then, in my dream, I start to find myself going down into strange cavernous depths of shining green, and I wake, in my dream, to begin fighting and toiling again against my compelling desire to give up. I do not know how long I made a fight of it in reality. It must have been for hours, alternately swimming, alternately resting myself by floating. I had queer thoughts. It was then about the time that some men were attempting to swim the channel. I remember laughing grimly, wishing them joy of their job. They were welcome to mine. I remember, too, that at last in the darkness I felt that I must give up, and said my prayers. And it was about that time, when I was beginning to feel a certain numbness of mind as well as weariness of body, that as I struck out in the mechanical and weakening fashion which I kept up from what little determination I had left, I came across my salvation, in the shape of a piece of wreckage that shoved itself against me in the blackness, as if it had been some faithful dog, pushing its nose into my hand to let me know it was there. It was no more than a square of grating, but it was heavy and substantial, and as I clung to and climbed onto it, I knew that it made all the difference to me between life and death. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Skillen. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 20. The Samaritan Skipper. I clung to that heaven-sent bit of wreckage, exhausted and weary, until the light began to break in the east. I was numbed and shivering with cold, but I was alive and safe. That square yard of good and solid wood was as much to me as if it had been a floating island. And as the light grew and grew, and the sun at last came up, a ball of fire out of the far horizon, I looked across the sea on all sides, hoping to catch sight of a sail or a wisp of smoke, of anything that would tell me of the near presence of human beings. And one fact I realized at once. I was further away from land than when I had begun my battle with death. There was no sign of land in the west. The sky was now clear and bright on all sides, but there was nothing to break the line where it met the sea. Before the fading of the light in the previous evening, I had easily made out the well-known outlines of the Cheviot on one hand and of Say's Law on the other. Now there was not a vestige of either. I knew from the fact that I had somehow drifted further and further away from the coast. There was accordingly nothing to do but wait the chance of being sighted and picked up, and I set to work as well as I could on my tiny raft to chafe my limbs and get some warmth into my body. And never in my life did I bless the sun as I did that morning, for when he sprang out of bed in the northeast skies, it was with his full and hearty vigour of high springtide, and his heat warmed my chill blood and sent a new glow of hope to my heart. But that heat was not an unmixed blessing, and I was already parched with thirst. And as the sun mounted higher and higher, pouring his rays full upon me, the thirst became almost intolerable, and my tongue felt as if my mouth could no longer contain it. It was perhaps 1 hour after sunrise, when my agony was becoming almost insupportable, that I first noticed a wisp of smoke on the southern rim of the circle of the sea, which just then was all my world. I had never strained my eyes for anything as I did for that patch of grey against the cloudless blue. It grew bigger and bigger. I knew, of course, that it was some steamer gradually approaching, but it seemed ages before I could make out her funnels. ages before I saw the first bit of her black hulk show up above the level of the dancing waves. Yet there she was at last, coming bows on, straight in my direction. My nerves must have given out at the sight. I remember the tears rolling down my cheeks. I remember hearing myself make strange sounds, which I suppose were those of relief and thankfulness. And then the horror of being unseen, of being left to endure more tortures of thirst, of the steamer changing her course, fell on me. And long before she was anywhere near me, I was trying to balance myself on the grating so that I could stand erect and attract her attention. She was a very slow-going craft, that, not able to do more than 9 or 10 knots at best, and another hour passed before she was anywhere near me. But, thank God, she came within a mile of me, and I made shift to stand up on my raft and to wave to her, and thereon she altered her course and lumbered over in my direction. She was one of the ugliest vessels that ever left a shipyard, but I thought I had never seen anything so beautiful in my life as she looked in those moments, and I had certainly never been so thankful for anything as for her solid and dirty deck when willing and kindly hands helped me up in it. Half an hour after that, with dry clothes on me and hot coffee and rum inside me, I was closeted with the skipper in his cabin, telling him, under a strict pledge of secrecy, as much of my tale as I felt inclined to share with him. He was a sympathetic and understanding man, and he swore warmly and plentifully when he heard how treacherously I had been treated, intimating it as the just then dearest wish of his heart to have the handling of the man who had played me the trick. "But you'll be dealing with him yourself," said he. "Man, you'll not spare him. Promise me you'll not spare him, and you'll send me a newspaper the full account of all that's done to him when you've set the law to work. Tod, I hope they'll quarter him. Them was grand days when there was more licence and liberty in punishing malefactors. Oh, I'd like fine to see this man put into boiling oil or something of that sort, the cold-hearted, murdering villain. You'll be sure to send me the newspaper." I laughed for the first time since, oh, when? It seemed years since I'd laughed, and yet it was only a few hours after all. "Before I can set the law to work on him, I must get on dry land, Captain," I answered. "Where are you going?" "Dundee," he replied, "Dundee. And we're just between 60 and 70 miles away now, and it's near 7 o'clock. We'll be in Dundee early in the afternoon anyway." "And what'll you do there? You'll be for getting the next train to Berwick." "Oh, I'm not so sure, Captain," I answered. "I don't want that man to know I'm alive yet. It'll be a nice surprise for him later. But there are those that I must let know as soon as possible. So the first thing I'll do, I'll wire. And in the meantime, let me have a sleep." The steamer that had picked me up was nothing but a tramp plodding along with a general cargo from London to Dundee, and its accommodation was as rough as the skipper was homely. But it was a veritable palace of delight and luxury to me after that terrible night, and I was soon hard and fast asleep in the skipper's own bunk, and was still asleep when he laid a hand on me at 3 o'clock that afternoon. "We're in the Tay," he said, "and we'll dock in half an hour. And now, you can't go ashore in your underclothing, man. Where's your purse?" He had rightly sized up the situation. I'd got rid of everything but my singlet and drawers in the attempt to keep going, for as my purse, that was where the rest of my possessions were, sunk or floating. "You and me's about of a build," he remarked. "I'll fit you up with a good suit that I have and lend you what money you want. But what is it you're going to do?" "How long are you going to stop here in Dundee, Captain?" I asked. 4 days, he answered. "I'll be discharging tomorrow and loading the next 2 days, and then I'll be away again." "Lend me the clothes and a sovereign," said I. "I'll wire to my principal, the gentleman I told you about, to come here at once with clothes and money, so I'll repay you and hand you your suit back first thing tomorrow morning, when I'll bring him to see you." He immediately pulled a sovereign out of his pocket, and turning to a locker, produced a new suit of blue serge and some necessary linen. "Aye," he remarked a bit wonderingly. "You'll be for fetching him along here, then? And for what purpose?" "I want him to take your evidence about picking me up," I answered. "That's one thing, and, well, there's other reasons we'll tell you about afterwards. And don't tell anybody here of what's happened, and pass the word for silence to your crew. It'll be something in their pockets when my friend comes along." He was a cute man, and he understood that my object was to keep the news of my escape from Sir Gilbert Carstairs, and he promised to do what I asked. And before long, he and I being, as I'd observed, very much of a size, and the serge suit fitting me very well, I was in the streets of Dundee, where I had never been before, seeking out a telegraph office and twiddling the skipper's sovereign between thumb and finger while I worked out a problem that needed some little thought. I must let my mother and Maisie know of my safety at once. I must let Mr. Lindsey know too. I knew what must have happened there at Berwick. That monstrous villain would sneak home and say that a sad accident had happened to me. It made me grind my teeth and long to get my hands at his lying tongue when I thought of what Maisie and my mother must have suffered after hearing his tales and excuses. But I did not want him to know I was safe. I did not want the town to know. Should I telephone to Mr. Lindsay's office, it was almost certain one of my fellow clerks there would answer the ring and recognise my voice. Then everything would be noised around. And after thinking it all over, I sent Mr. Lindsay a telegram in the following words, hoping that he would fully understand. "Keep this secret from everybody. Stop. Bring suit of clothes, linen, money, mother and Maisie by next train to Dundee. Stop. Give post office people orders not to let this out. Most important. Stop. H.M." I read that out over half a dozen times before I finally dispatched it. It seemed all wrong somehow, and all right in another way. And however badly put it was, it expressed my meaning. So I handed it in, and my borrowed sovereign with it, and jingling the change which was given back to me, I went out to the telegraph office to stare around me. It was a queer thing, but I was now as light-headed as could be. I caught myself laughing from a curious feeling of pleasure. The truth was, if you want to analyse the sources, I was vastly relieved to be able to get in touch with my own people. Within an hour, perhaps sooner, they would have the news, and I knew well that they would lose no time in setting off to me. And finding myself just then in the neighbourhood of the North British Railway Station, I went in and managed to make out that if Mr. Lindsay was at the office when my wire arrived, and acted promptly in accordance with it, he and they could reach Dundee by a late train that evening. That knowledge, of course, made me in a still more light-hearted mood. But there was another source of my satisfaction and complacence. Things were in a grand way now for my revenge on Sir Gilbert Carstairs, and what had been a mystery was one no longer. I went back to the dock where I had left the tramp steamer and told its good-natured skipper what I had done, for he was as much interested in the affair as if he had been my own brother. And that accomplished, I left him again and went sightseeing, having been wonderfully refreshed and up and restored by my good sleep of the morning. I wandered up and down and about Dundee till I was leg-weary, and it was nearly 6 o'clock of the afternoon. And at that time, being in Bank Street and looking about me for some place where I could get a cup of tea and a bite of food, I chanced by sheer accident to see a name on a brass plate, fixed amongst more of the same sort, on the outer door of a suite of offices. That name was Gavin Smeaton. I recalled it at once, and moved by a sudden impulse, I went climbing up a lot of steps to Mr. Gavin Smeaton's office. End of chapter 20. Recording by Ian Skillen.
Chapter 21 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 21 Mr. Gavin Smeaton. I walked into a room right at the top of the building, wherein a young man of 30 or thereabouts was sitting at a desk, putting together a quantity of letters which a lad, standing by his side, was evidently about to carry to the post. He was a good-looking, alert, business-like sort of young man this, of a superior type of countenance, very well dressed, and altogether a noticeable person. What first struck me about him was, that though he gave me a quick glance when, having first tapped at his door and walked inside his office, I stood there confronting him, he finished his immediate concern before giving me any further attention. It was not until he had given all the letters to the lad and bade him hurry off to the post that he turned to me with another sharp look and one word of interrogation. "Yes?" he said. "Mr. Gavin Smeaton?" asked I. "That's my name," he answered. "What can I do for you?" Up to that moment I had not the least idea as to the exact reasons which had led me to climb those stairs. The truth was, I had acted on impulse. And now that I was actually in the presence of a man who was obviously a very businesslike and matter-of-fact sort of person, I felt awkward and tongue-tied. He was looking me over all the time as if there was a wonder in his mind about me, and when I was slow in answering, he stirred a bit impatiently in his chair. "My business hours are over for the day," he said. "If it's business—" "It's not business in the ordinary sense, Mr. Smeaton," I made shift to get out. "But it is business for all that. The fact is, you'll remember that the Berwick police sent you a telegram some days ago asking did you know anything about a man named John Phillips?" He showed a sudden interest at that, and he regarded me with a slight smile. "You aren't a detective?" he inquired. "No, I'm a solicitor's clerk," I replied, "from Berwick. My principal, Mr. Lindsey, has to do with that case." He nodded at a pile of newspapers which stood with a heavy book on top of it, on a side table near his desk. "So I see from these papers," he remarked. "I've read all I could about the affairs of both Phillips and Crone, ever since I heard that my name and address had been found on Phillips. Has any further light been thrown on that? Of course, there was nothing much in my name and address being found on the man, nor would there be if they were found on any man. As you see, I'm a general agent for various sorts of foreign merchandise, and this man had likely been recommended to me, especially if he was from America." "There's been no further light on that matter, Mr. Smeaton," I answered. He had pointed me to a chair at his desk side by that time, and we were mutually inspecting each other. "Nothing more has been heard on that point." "Then, have you come purposely to see me about it?" he asked. "Not at all," said I. "I was passing along this street below, and I saw your name on the door, and I remembered it, and so I just came up." "Oh!" he said, looking at me rather blankly. "You're staying in Dundee? Taking a holiday?" "I came to Dundee in a fashion I'd not like to follow on any other occasion," said I. "If a man hadn't lent me this suit of clothes and a sovereign, I'd have come ashore in my undergarments, and without a penny." He stared at me more blankly than ever when I let this out on him, and suddenly he laughed. "What riddle's all this?" he asked. "It sounds like a piece out of a story-book, one of those tales of adventure." "Aye, does it?" said I. "Only in my case, Mr. Smeaton, fact's been a lot stranger than fiction. You've read all about this Berwick mystery in the newspapers?" "Every word, seeing that I was mentioned," he answered. "Then I'll give you the latest chapter," I continued. "You'll know my name when you hear it. Hugh Moneylaws. It was I discovered Philip's dead body." I saw that he had been getting more and more interested as we talked. At the mention of my name his interest obviously increased. And suddenly he pulled a box of cigars towards him, took one out, and pushed the box to me. "Help yourself, Mr. Moneylaws, and go ahead," he said. "I'm willing to hear as many chapters as you like of this story." I shook my head at the cigars, and went on to tell him of all that had happened since the murder of Crone. He was a good listener. He took in every detail, every point, quietly smoking while I talked, and never interrupting me. And when I had made an end, he threw up his head with a significant gesture that implied much. "That beats all the story-books!" he exclaimed. "I'm glad to see you're safe, anyway, Mr. Moneylaws, and your mother and your young lady'll be glad too." "They will that, Mr. Smeaton," I said. "I'm much obliged to you." "You think that man really meant you to drown?" he asked. "What would you think yourself, Mr. Smeaton?" I replied. "Besides, didn't I see his face as he got himself and his yacht away from me? Yon man is a murderer." "It's a queer, strange business," he remarked, nodding his head. "You'll be thinking now, of course, that it was he murdered both Phillips and Crone, eh?" "Aye, I do think that," said I. "What else?" And he wanted to silence me because I'm the only living person that could let out about seeing him at the Crossroads that night, and could prove that Crone saw him too. My own impression is that Crone went straight to him after his talk with me, and paid the penalty. "That's likely," he assented. "But what do you think made him turn on you so suddenly yesterday, when things looked like going smoothly about everything, and he'd given you that stewardship, which was, of course, to stop your mouth?" "I'll tell you," I said. "It was Mr. Lindsey's fault. He let out too much at the police court. Carstairs was there. He'd a seat on the bench, and Mr. Lindsey frightened him. Maybe it was yon ice axe. Mr. Lindsey's got some powerful card up his sleeve about that. What it is I don't know. But I'm certain now, that Carstairs took a fear into his head at those proceedings yesterday morning, and he thought he'd settle me once and for all before I could be drawn into it and forced to say things that would be against him." "I dare say you're right," he agreed. "Well, it is indeed a strange affair, and there'll be some stranger revelations yet. I'd like to see this Mr. Lindsey. You're sure he'll come to you here?" "Aye, unless there's been an earthquake between here and Tweed," I declared. "He'll be here right enough, Mr. Smeaton, before many hours are over. And he'll like to see you. You can't think now of how or why yon Phillips man could have got that bit of letter paper of yours on him? It was like that," I added, pointing to a block of memorandum forms that stood in his stationery case at the desk before him. "Just the same." "I can't," said he. "But there's nothing unusual in that. Some correspondent of mine might have handed it to him, torn it off one of my letters, do you see? I've correspondents in a great many seaports and mercantile centres, both here and in America." "These men will appear to have come from Central America," I remarked. "They'd seem to have been employed one way or another on that Panama Canal affair that there's been so much in the papers about these last few years. You'd noticed that in the accounts, Mr. Smeaton?" "I did," he replied, "and it interested me because I'm from those parts myself. I was born there." He said that as if this fact was of no significance, but the news made me prick up my ears. "Do tell me that," said I. "Where now, if it's a fair question?" "New Orleans. Near enough, anyway, to those parts," he answered. "But I was sent across here when I was 10 years old to be educated and brought up, and here I've been ever since." "But you're a Scotsman?" I made bold to ask him. "Aye, on both sides, though I was born out of Scotland," he answered with a laugh. And then he got out of his chair. "It's mighty interesting all this," he went on, "but I'm a married man, and my wife will be wanting me for dinner. Now, will you bring Mr. Lindsey to see me in the morning, if he comes?" "He'll come, and I'll bring him," I answered. "He'll be right glad to see you, too, for it may be, Mr. Smeaton, that there is something to be traced out of that bit of letter paper of yours yet." "It may be," he agreed. "And if there's any help I can give, it's at your disposal. But you'll be finding this you're in a dark lane with some queer turnings in it before you come to the plain outcome of all this business." We went down into the street together, and after he had asked if there was anything he could do for me that night, and I had assured him there was not, we parted with an agreement that Mr. Lindsey and I should call at his office early next morning. When he had left me, I sought out a place where I could get some supper, and that over, I idled about the town until it was time for the train from the south to get in. And I was on the platform when it came, and there was my mother and Maisie and Mr. Lindsey, and I saw at a glance that all that was filling each was sheer and infinite surprise. My mother gripped me on the instant. "Hugh!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing here, and what does all this mean? Such a fright as you've given us! What's the meaning of it?" I was so taken aback, having been certain that Carstairs would have gone home and told them I was accidentally drowned, that all I could do was to stare from one to the other. As for Maisie, she only looked wonderingly at me. As for Mr. Lindsey, he gazed at me as scrutinizingly as my mother was doing. "Aye," said he, "what's the meaning of it, young man? We've done your bidding, and more, but why?" I found my tongue at that. "What!" I exclaimed. "Haven't you seen Sir Gilbert Carstairs? Didn't you hear from him that—" "We know nothing about Sir Gilbert Carstairs," he interrupted. "The fact is, my lad, that until your wire arrived this afternoon, nobody had even heard of you or Sir Gilbert Carstairs since you went off in his yacht yesterday. Neither he nor the yacht have ever returned to Berwick. Where are they?" End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, June 2007. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 22. I Read My Own Obituary. It was my turn to stare again. And stare I did, from one to the other in silence, and being far too much amazed to find ready speech. And before I could get my tongue once more, my mother, who was always remarkably sharp of eye, got her word in. "What are you doing in that new suit of clothes?" she demanded. "And where's your own good clothes as you went away in yesterday noon? I misdoubt this stewardship's leading you into some strange ways." "My own good clothes, mother, are somewhere in the North Sea," retorted I. "Top or bottom, sunk or afloat, it's there you'll find them, if you're more anxious about them than me. Do you tell me that Carstairs has never been home?" I went on, turning to Mr. Lindsey. "Then I don't know where he is, nor his yacht either. All I know is that he left me to drown last night, a good 20 miles from land, and that it's only by a special mercy of Providence that I'm here. Wherever he is, yon man's a murderer. I've settled that, Mr. Lindsey." The women began to tremble and to exclaim at this news, and to ask one question after another, and Mr. Lindsey shook his head impatiently. "We can't stand talking our affairs in the station all night," said he. "Let's go to an hotel, my lad. We're all wanting our suppers. You don't seem as if you were in very bad spirits yourself." "I'm all right, Mr. Lindsey," I answered cheerfully. "I've been down to Jericho, it's true, and to worse, but I chanced across a good Samaritan or two. And I've looked out a clean and comfortable hotel for you, and we'll go there now." I led them away to a good hotel that I had noticed in my walks, and while they took their suppers I sat by and told them all my adventure, to the accompaniment of many exclamations from my mother and Maisie. But Mr. Lindsey made none, and I was quick to notice that what most interested him was that I had been to see Mr. Gavin Smeaton. "But what for did you not come straight home when you were safely on shore again?" asked my mother, who was thinking of the expense I was putting her to. "What's the reason of fetching us all this way when you're alive and well?" I looked at Mr. Lindsey, knowingly, I suppose. "Because, mother," I answered her, "I believed yon Carstairs would go back to Berwick and tell that there'd been a sad accident, and I was dead, drowned, and I wanted to let him go on thinking that I was dead, and so I decided to keep away. And if he is alive, it'll be the best thing to let the man still go on thinking I was drowned, as I'll prove to Mr. Lindsey there. If Carstairs is alive, I say, it's the right policy for me to keep out of his sight and our neighbourhood." "Aye," agreed Mr. Lindsey, who was a quick hand at taking up things. "There's something in that, Hugh." "Well, it's beyond me, all this," observed my mother, "and it all comes of me taking yon Gilverthwaite into the house. But me and Maisie'll away to our beds, and maybe you and Mr. Lindsey'll get more light out of the matter than I can, and glad I'll be when all this mystery's cleared up, and we'll be able to live as honest folk should, without all this flying about the country and spending good money." I contrived to get a few minutes with Maisie, however, before she and my mother retired, and I found then that, had I known it, I need not have been so anxious and disturbed. For they had attached no particular importance to the fact that I had not returned the night before. They had thought that Sir Gilbert had sailed his yacht in elsewhere, and that I would be turning up later, and there had been no great to-do after me until my own telegram had arrived, when, of course, there was consternation and alarm, and nothing but hurry to catch the next train north. But Mr. Lindsey had contrived to find out that nothing had been seen of Sir Gilbert Carstairs and his yacht at Berwick, and to that point he and I at once turned when the women had gone to bed, and I went with him into the smoking room while he had his pipe and his drop of whisky. By that time I had told him of the secret about the meeting at the crossroads, and about my interview with Crone at his shop, and Sir Gilbert Carstairs at Hathercleugh, when he offered me the stewardship, and I was greatly relieved when Mr. Lindsey let me down lightly and said no more than that if I'd told him these things at first there might have been a great difference. "But we're on the beginning of something," he concluded. "That Sir Gilbert Carstairs has some connection with these murders I'm now convinced, but what it is I'm not yet certain. What I am certain about is that he took fright yesterday morning in our court when I produced that ice axe and asked the doctor those questions about it." "And I'm sure of that too, Mr. Lindsey," said I. "And I've been wondering what there was about yon ice axe that frightened him. You'll know that yourself, of course." "Aye, but I'm not going to tell you," he answered. "You'll have to await developments on that point, my man. And now we'll be getting to bed, and in the morning we'll see this Mr. Gavin Smeaton. It would be a queer thing now, wouldn't it, if we got some clue to all this through him? But I'm keenly interested in hearing that he comes from the other side of the Atlantic, Hugh, for I've been of opinion that it's across there that the secret of the whole thing will be found." They had brought me a supply of clothes and money with them, and first thing in the morning I went off to the docks and found my Samaritan skipper, and gave him back his sovereign and his blue serge suit, with my heartiest thanks and a promise to keep him fully posted up in the development of what he called the case. and then I went back to breakfast with the rest of them, and at once there was the question of what was to be done. My mother was all for going homeward as quickly as possible, and it ended up in our seeing her and Maisie away by the next train, Mr. Lindsey having made both swear solemnly that they would not divulge one word of what had happened, nor reveal the fact that I was alive to any living soul but Andrew Dunlop, who, of course, could be trusted. And my mother agreed, though the proposal was anything but pleasant or proper to her. "You're putting on me more than any woman ought to be asked to bear, Mr. Lindsey," said she, as we saw them into the train. "You're asking me to go home and behave as if we didn't know whether the lad was alive or dead. I'm not good at play acting, and I'm far from sure that it's either truthful or honest to be professing things that isn't so. And I'll be much obliged to you if you'll get all this cleared up, and let Hugh there settle down to his work in the proper way, instead of wandering about on business that's no concern of his." We shook our heads at each other as the train went off, Maisie waving good-bye to us, and my mother sitting very stiff and stern and disapproving in her corner of the compartment. "No concern of yours, d'ye hear, my lad?" laughed Mr. Lindsey. "Aye, but your mother forgets that in affairs of this sort a lot of people are drawn in where they aren't concerned. It's like being on the edge of a whirlpool, you're dragged into it before you're aware. And now we'll go and see this Mr. Smeaton. But first, where's the telegraph office in this station? I want to wire to Murray to ask him to keep me posted up during the day if any news comes in about the yacht." When Mr. Lindsey was in the telegraph office, I bought that morning's Dundee Advertiser, more to fill up a few spare moments than from any particular desire to get the news, for I was not a great newspaper reader. I had scarcely opened it when I saw my own name, and there I stood, in the middle of the bustling railway station, enjoying the sensation of reading my own obituary notice. Our Berwick-on-Tweed correspondent, telegraphing late last night, says, "Considerable anxiety is being felt in the town respecting the fate of Sir Gilbert Carstairs, Baronet, of Hathercleugh House, and Mr. Hugh Moneylaws, who are feared to have suffered a disaster at sea. At noon yesterday, Sir Gilbert, accompanied by Mr. Moneylaws, went out in the former's yacht, a small vessel of light weight, for a sail which, according to certain fishermen, who were about when the yacht left, was to be one of a few hours only. The yacht had not returned last night, nor has it been seen or heard of since its departure. Various Berwick fishing craft have been well off the coast during today, but no tidings of the missing gentleman have come to hand. Nothing has been heard of or from Sir Gilbert at Hathercleugh up to 9 o'clock this evening, and the only ray of hope lies in the fact that Mr. Moneylaw's mother left the town hurriedly this afternoon, possibly having received some news of her son. It is believed here, however, that the light vessel was capsized in a sudden squall, and that both occupants have lost their lives. Sir Gilbert Carstairs, who was the 7th Baronet, had only recently come to the neighbourhood on succeeding to the title and estates. Mr. Moneylaws, who was senior clerk to Mr. Lindsey, solicitor, of Berwick, was a very promising young man of great ability, and had recently been much before the public eye as a witness in connection with the mysterious murders of John Phillips and Abel Crone, which are still attracting so much attention." I shoved the newspaper into Mr. Lindsey's hand as he came out of the telegraph office. He read the paragraph in silence, smiling as he read. "Aye," he said at last, "you have to leave home to get the home news. Well, they're welcome to be thinking that for the present. I've just wired Murray that I'll be here till at any rate this evening, and that he's to telegraph at once if there's tidings of that yacht or of Carstairs. Meanwhile, we'll go and see this Mr. Smeaton." Mr. Smeaton was expecting us. He too was reading about me in the Advertiser when we entered, and he made some joking remark about it only being great men that were sometimes treated to death notices before they were dead. And then he turned to Mr. Lindsey, who I noticed had been taking close stock of him. "I've been thinking out things since Mr. Moneylaws was in here last night," he remarked. "Bringing my mind to bed, you see, on certain points that I hadn't thought of before. And maybe there's something more than appears at first sight in yon man John Phillips having my name and address on him." "Aye?" asked Mr. Lindsey quietly. "How now?" "Well," replied Mr. Smeaton, "there may be something in it, and there may be nothing, just nothing at all. But it's the fact that my father hailed from Tweedside, and from some place not so far from Berwick." End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl, St. Louis, Missouri, June 2007. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 23. Family History. I was watching Mr. Lindsey pretty closely, being desirous of seeing how he took to Mr. Gavin Smeaton and what he made of him, and I saw him prick his ears at this announcement. Clearly, it seemed to suggest something of interest to him. "I?" he exclaimed. "Your father hailed from Berwick, or thereabouts? You don't know exactly from where, Mr. Smeaton?" "No, I don't," replied Smeaton promptly. "The truth is, strange as it may seem, Mr. Lindsey, I know precious little about my father, and what I do know is mostly from hearsay. I've no recollection of having ever seen him, and, more wondrous still, you'll say, I don't know whether he's alive or dead." Here, indeed, was something that bordered on the mysterious, and Mr. Lindsey and myself, who had been dealing in that commodity to some considerable degree of late, exchanged glances, and Smeaton saw us look at each other, and he smiled and went on. "I was thinking all this out last night," he said, "and it came to me, I wonder if that man, John Phillips, who had, as I hear, my name and address in his pocket, could have been some man who was coming to see me on my father's behalf, or, it's an odd thing to fancy, and, considering what's happened to him, not a pleasant one, could have been my father himself?" There was silence amongst us for a moment. This was a new vista down which we were looking, and it was full of thick shadow. As for me, I began to recollect things. According to the evidence which Chisholm had got from the British Linen Bank at Peebles, John Phillips had certainly come from Panama. Just as certainly he had made for Tweedside, and, with equal certainty, nobody at all had come forward to claim him, to assert kinship with him, though there had been the widest publicity given to the circumstances of his murder. In Gilverthwaite's instance, his sister had quickly turned up, to see what there was for her. Phillips had been just as freely mentioned in the newspapers as Gilverthwaite, but no one had made inquiries after him, though there was a tidy sum of money of his in the Peebles Bank for his next of kin to claim. Who was he, then? Mr. Lindsey was evidently deep in thought, or, I should perhaps say, in surmise, and he seemed to arrive where I did, at a question, which was, of course, just that which Smeaton had suggested. "I might answer that better if I knew what you could tell me about your father, Mr. Smeaton," he said, "and about yourself." "I'll tell you all I can with pleasure," answered Smeaton. "To tell you the truth, I never attached much importance to this matter, in spite of my name and address being found on Phillips, until Mr. Moneylaws there came in last night, and then, after what he told me, I did begin to think pretty deeply over it, and I'm coming to the opinion that there's a lot more in this than appears on the surface." "You can affirm that with confidence," remarked Mr. Lindsey dryly. "There is." "Well, about my father," continued Smeaton. "All I know is this, and I got it from hearsay. His name, the name given to me anyway, was Martin Smeaton. He hailed somewhere about Berwick. Whether it was on the English side or the Scottish side of the Tweed, I don't know. But he went to America as a young man, with a young wife, and they were in New Orleans when I was born. And when I was born my mother died, so I never knew her." "Do you know her maiden name?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "No more than that her Christian name was Mary," replied Smeaton. "You'll find out as I go on that it's very little I do know of anything, definitely. Well, when my mother died, my father evidently left New Orleans and went off travelling. I've made out that he must have been a regular rolling stone at all times, a man that couldn't rest long in one place. But he didn't take me with him. There was a Scotsman and his wife in New Orleans that my father had foregathered with, some people of the name of Watson, and he left me with them. And in their care in New Orleans I remained until I was 10 years old. From my recollection, he evidently paid them well for looking after me. There was never at any time any need of money on my account, and, of course, never having known any other, I came to look on the Watsons as father and mother. When I was 10 years old they returned to Scotland, here to Dundee, and I came with them. I have a letter or two that my father wrote at the time, giving instructions as to what was to be done with me. I was to have the best education, as much as I liked and was capable of, and, though I didn't know then, and don't now, know all the details, it's evident he furnished Watson with plenty of funds on my behalf. We came here to Dundee, and I was put to the high school, and there I stopped till I was 18, and then I had 2 years at University College. Now, the odd thing was that all that time, though I knew that regular and handsome remittances came to the Watsons on my behalf from my father, he never expressed any wishes or made any suggestions as to what I should do with myself. But I was all for commercial life, and when I left college I went into an office here in the town and began to study the ins and outs of foreign trade. Then, when I was just 21, my father sent me a considerable sum, £2,000, as a matter of fact, saying it was for me to start business with. And do you know, Mr. Lindsey, from that day, now 10 years ago, to this, I've never heard a word of him." Mr. Lindsey was always an attentive man in a business interview, but I had never seen him listen to anybody so closely as he listened to Mr. Smeaton, and after his usual fashion he at once began to ask questions. "Those Watsons, now," he said, "they're living?" "No," replied Smeaton, "both dead a few years ago." "That's a pity," remarked Mr. Lindsey, "but you'll have recollections of what they told you about your father from their own remembrance of him." "They'd little to tell," said Smeaton. "I made out they knew very little indeed of him, except that he was a tall, fine-looking fellow, evidently of superior class and education. Of my mother they knew less." "You'll have letters of your father's?" suggested Mr. Lindsey. "Just a few mere scraps. He was never a man who did more than write down what he wanted doing, and as briefly as possible," replied Smeaton. "In fact," he added with a laugh, "his letters to me were what you might call odd. When the money came that I mentioned just now, he wrote me the shortest note. I can repeat every word of it. 'I've sent Watson £2,000 for you,' he wrote. 'You can start yourself in business with it, as I hear you're inclined that way, and some day I'll come over and see how you're getting along.' That was all." "And you've never heard of or from him since?" exclaimed Mr. Lindsey. "That's a strange thing, now. But where was he then? Where did he send the money from?" "New York," replied Smeaton. "The other letters I have from him are from places in both North and South America. It always seemed to me and the Watsons that he was never in any place for long, always going about." "I should like to see those letters, Mr. Smeaton," said Mr. Lindsey, "especially the last one." "They're at my house," answered Smeaton. "I'll bring them down here this afternoon and show them to you if you'll call in. But now, do you think this man Phillips may have been my father?" "Well," replied Mr. Lindsey reflectively, "it's an odd thing that Phillips, whoever he was, drew £500 in cash out of the British Linen Bank at Peebles and carried it straight away to Tweedside, where you believe your father came from. It looks as if Peebles had meant to do something with that cash, to give it to somebody, you know." "I read the description of Phillips in the newspapers," remarked Smeaton, "but of course it conveyed nothing to me." "You've no photograph of your father?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "No, none. Never had," answered Smeaton. "Nor any papers of his, except those bits of letters." Mr. Lindsey sat in silence for a time, tapping the point of his stick on the floor and staring at the carpet. "I wish we knew what that man Gilverthwaite was wanting at Berwick and in the district," he said at last. "But isn't that evident?" suggested Smeaton. "He was looking in the parish registers. I've a good mind to have a search made in those quarters for particulars of my father." Mr. Lindsey gave him a sharp look. "Aye," he said in a rather sly fashion, "but you don't know if your father's real name was Smeaton?" Both Smeaton and myself started at that. It was a new idea, and I saw that it struck Smeaton with great force. "True," he replied, after a pause. "I don't. It might have been, and in that case how could one find out what it was?" Mr. Lindsey got up, shaking his head. "A big job," he answered. "A stiff job. You'll have to work back a long way. But it could be done. What time can I look in this afternoon, Mr. Smeaton, to get a glance at those letters?" 3 o'clock, replied Smeaton. He walked to the door of his office with us and gave me a smile. "You're none the worse for your adventure, I see," he remarked. "Well, what about this man Carstairs? What news of him?" "We'll maybe be able to tell you some later in the day," replied Mr. Lindsey. "There'll be lots of news about him, one way or another, before we're through with all this." We went out into the street then, and at his request I took Mr. Lindsey to the docks to see the friendly skipper, who was greatly delighted to tell the story of my rescue. We stopped on his ship talking with him for a good part of the morning, and it was well past noon when we went back to the hotel for lunch. And the first thing we saw there was a telegram for Mr. Lindsey. He tore the envelope open as we stood in the hall, and I made no apology for looking over his shoulder and reading the message with him. Just heard by wire from Largo Police that small yacht answering description of Carstairs has been brought in there by fishermen who found it early this morning in Largo Bay, empty. We looked at each other, and Mr. Lindsey suddenly laughed. "Empty!" he exclaimed. "Aye, but that doesn't prove that the man's dead." End of chapter 23 of Dead Men's Money.
Chapter 24 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 24. The Suit of Clothes. Mr. Lindsey made no further remark until we were half through our lunch, and it was not to me that he then spoke, but to a waiter who was just at his elbow. "There's 3 things you can get me," he said. "Our bill, a railway guide, a map of Scotland. Bring the map first." The man went away, and Mr. Lindsey bent across the table. "Largo is in Fife," said he. "We'll go there. I'm going to see that yacht with my own eyes, and hear with my own ears what the man who found it has got to say. For, as I remarked just now, my lad, the mere fact that the yacht was found empty doesn't prove that Carstairs has been drowned. And we'll just settle up here, and go round and see Smeaton to get a look at those letters, and then we'll take the train to Largo and make a bit of inquiry." Mr. Smeaton had the letters spread out on his desk when we went in, and Mr. Lindsey looked them over. There was not more than half a dozen altogether, and they were mere scraps, as he had said, usually a few lines on half sheets of paper. Mr. Lindsey appeared to take no great notice of any of them but the last, the one that Smeaton had quoted to us in the morning. But over that he bent for some time, examining it closely in silence. "I wish you'd lend me this for a day or 2, he said at last. "I'll take the greatest care of it. It shan't go out of my own personal possession, and I'll return it by registered post. The fact is, Mr. Smeaton, I want to compare that writing with some other writing." "Certainly," agreed Smeaton, handing the letter over. "I'll do anything I can to help. I'm beginning, you know, Mr. Lindsey, to fear I'm mixed up in this. You'll keep me informed?" "I can give you some information now," answered Mr. Lindsey, pulling out the telegram. "There's more mystery, d'ye see, and Moneylaws and I are off to Largo now. We'll take it on our way home. For by this and that I'm going to know what's become of Sir Gilbert Carstairs." We presently left Mr. Gavin Smeaton, with a promise to keep him posted up, and a promise on his part that he'd come to Berwick, if that seemed necessary, and then we set out on our journey. It was not such an easy business to get quickly to Largo, and the afternoon was wearing well into the evening when we reached it, and found the police official who had wired to Berwick. There was not much that he could tell us. Of his own knowledge, the yacht, he said, was now lying in the harbour at Lower Largo, where it had been brought in by a fisherman named Andrew Robertson, to whom he offered to take us. Him we found at a little inn near the harbour, a taciturn, somewhat sour-faced fellow, who showed no great desire to talk, and would probably have given us scant information if we had not been accompanied by the police official, though he brightened up when Mr. Lindsey hinted at the possibility of reward. "When did you come across this yacht?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "Between 8 and 9 o'clock this morning," replied Robertson. "And where?" "About 70 miles out, a bit outside the bay." "Empty?" demanded Mr. Lindsey, looking keenly at the man. "Not a soul in her?" "Not a soul," answered Robertson. "Neither alive nor dead." "Were her sails set at all?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "They were not. She was just drifting anywhere," replied the man, "and I put a line to her and brought her in." "Any other craft than yours about at the time?" inquired Mr. Lindsey. "Not within a few miles," said Robertson. We went off to the yacht then. She had been towed into a quiet corner of the harbour, and an old fellow who was keeping guard over her assured us that nobody but the police had been aboard her since Robertson brought her in. We of course went aboard, Mr. Lindsey, after being assured by me that this was really Sir Gilbert Carstairs' yacht, remarking that he didn't know we could do much good by doing so. But I speedily made a discovery of singular and significant importance. Small as she was, the yacht possessed a cabin. There was no great amount of headroom in it, it's true, and a tall man could not stand upright in it, but it was spacious for a craft of that size, and amply furnished with shelving and lockers, and on these lockers lay the clothes, a Norfolk suit of grey tweed, in which Sir Gilbert Carstairs had set out with me from Berwick. I let out a fine exclamation when I saw that, and the other three turned and stared at me. "Mr. Lindsey," I said, "look here! Those are the clothes he was wearing when I saw the last of him, and there's the shirt he had on, too, and the shoes. Wherever he is, whatever happened to him, he made a complete change of linen and clothing before he quitted the yacht. That's a plain fact, Mr. Lindsey." A fact it was, and one that made me think. However, it affected the others. It disposed, for instance, any notion or theory of suicide. A man doesn't change his clothes if he's going to drown himself, and it looked as if this had been part of some premeditated plan. At the very least of it, it was a curious thing. "You're sure of that?" inquired Mr. Lindsey, eyeing the things that had been thrown aside. "Dead sure of it," said I. "I couldn't be mistaken." "Did he bring a portmanteau or anything aboard with him, then?" asked he. "He didn't, but he could have kept clothes and linen and the like in these lockers," I pointed out, beginning to lift the lids. "See here, here's brushes and combs and the like. I tell you, before ever he left this yacht, or fell out of it, or whatever's happened to him, he'd changed everything from his toe to his top. There's the very cap he was wearing." They all looked at each other, and Mr. Lindsey's gaze finally fastened itself on Andrew Robertson. "I suppose you don't know anything about this, my friend?" he asked. "What should I know?" answered Robertson, a bit surly. "The yacht's just as I found it. Not a thing's been touched." There was the luncheon basket lying on the cabin table just as I had last seen it, except that Carstairs had evidently finished the provisions which he and I had left. And I think the same thought occurred to Mr. Lindsey and myself at the same moment. How long had he stopped on board that yacht after his cruel abandoning of me? For 48 hours had elapsed since that episode, and in 48 hours a man may do a great deal in the way of making himself scarce, which now seemed to me to be precisely what Sir Gilbert Carstairs had done, though in what particular fashion, and exactly why, it was beyond either of us to surmise. "I suppose no one has heard anything of this yacht having been seen drifting about yesterday, or during last night?" asked Mr. Lindsey, putting his question to both men. "No talk of it hereabouts?" But neither the police nor Andrew Robertson had heard a murmur of that nature, and there was evidently nothing to be got out of them more than we had already got. Nor had the police heard of any stranger being seen about there, though, as the man who was with us observed, there was no great likelihood of anybody noticing a stranger, for Largo was nowadays a somewhat popular seaside resort, and down there on the beach there are many strangers, it being summer and holiday time, so that a strange man more or less would pass unobserved. "Supposing a man landed about the coast here," asked Mr. Lindsey. "I'm just putting a case to you, and didn't go into town, but walked along the beach, where would he strike a railway station now?" The police official replied that there were railway stations to the right and left of the bay. A man could easily make Edinburgh in one direction and St. Andrews in the other. And then, not unnaturally, he was wanting to know if Mr. Lindsey was suggesting that Sir Gilbert Carstairs had sailed his yacht ashore, left it, and then it had drifted out to sea again. "I'm not suggesting anything," answered Mr. Lindsey. "I'm only speculating on possibilities, and that's about as idle work as standing here talking. What will be practical will be to arrange about this yacht being locked up in some boathouse, and we'd best see to that at once." We made arrangements with the owner of a boathouse to pull the yacht in there, and to keep her under lock and key, and, after settling matters with the police, to have an eye on her, and to see that her contents were untouched until further instructions reached them from Berwick. We went off to continue our journey. but we had stayed so long in Largo that when we got to Edinburgh the last train for Berwick had gone, and we were obliged to turn into a hotel for the night. Naturally, all of our talk was of what had just transpired. The events of the last 2 days, said Mr. Lindsey, had only made these mysteries deeper than they were before, and why Sir Gilbert Carstairs should have abandoned his yacht, as he doubtless had, was a still further addition to the growing problem. "And I am not certain, my lad, that I believe yon man Robertson's tale," he remarked, as we were discussing matters from every imaginable point of view just before going to bed. "He may have brought the yacht in, but we don't know that he didn't bring Carstairs aboard her. Why was that change of clothes made? Probably because he knew that he'd be described as wearing certain things, and he wanted to come ashore in other things. For aught we know, he came safely ashore, boarded a train somewhere in the neighbourhood, or at Largo itself, why not, and went off likely here to Edinburgh, where he'd mingle with a few thousands of folk unnoticed." "Then in that case you think he's what, Mr. Lindsey? Do you mean he's running away?" "Between you and me, that's not far from what I do think," he replied. "And I think I know what he's running away from, too. But we'll hear a lot more before many hours are over, or I'm mistaken." We were in Berwick at an early hour next morning, and we went straight to the police station and into the superintendent's office. Chisholm was with Mr. Murray when we walked in, and both men turned to us with eagerness. "Here's more mystery about this affair, Mr. Lindsey!" exclaimed Murray. "It's enough to make a man's wits go wool gathering. There's no news of Sir Gilbert, and Lady Carstairs has been missing since 12 o'clock noon yesterday." Chapter 24.